We're going to get ourselves into our seats. I'm just going to look at the tech people to say the mics are doing what they're supposed to be doing. I'm going to get a nod. Yeah, we're good with that. Good. So good morning, Victoria. Good morning, everyone. My name is Oliver Brandis. I'm the co-director at the Polis Project and the associate director at the Center for Global Studies. I am so pleased, it's a real pleasure to welcome you here today to Victoria. I'm so excited that we can gather and discuss this really important topic. But before we get started, as always, I want to start by acknowledging, with respect, the Lekwungen speaking people on whose traditional territory we gather today, the Songhees, the Squamish, and Wasonic people whose historical relationship with land and specifically water, very apropos, continue to this day. I also want to give a hearty shout out and thank you to the many volunteers, organizers, especially soft spot in my heart to the very special people at the Polis Project, led by Rolene, who's done a ton of the work. There's so many more. We all know that events like this don't just happen, right? They take work and thought, and then more work. I also want to make sure that we're acknowledging and registering that we have a whole bunch of viewers out there in what was once called TV land, now the web land, watching, so that's great. And of course, the Canadian Water Resources Association has been a big co-host and partner, and we'll get some remarks from them as well. And finally, most importantly, of course, we want to thank all the organizers, volunteers, etc. But I want to thank you all, right, for making yourself available to come out, to talk some water, talk some governance, talk about opportunities, talk about the future, how to think differently about some problems. I especially want to make sure that we are going to think about this as a very inclusive and exciting dialogue. I'm just madly looking around for Bruce, just confirming he's here. When we think about water, we can all recognize it as just such a simple substance. But when we think about the management or the governance, the watersheds, we recognize exactly how complex and the many challenges we face. We know that when water crosses boundaries among communities, between Indigenous nations and their traditional territories, and even across international borders such as Canada and the US, all this add up to a massive, massive challenge. The complexity, that's what we're here to face today. So with no further ado, I want to once again welcome you on behalf of the University of Victoria, Polis, and the Center for Global Studies here on our home, our campus here, and of course to our key organizer with the Canadian Water Resources Association. And I'm going to pass off this wonderful event to our Masters of Ceremony for the day, Bruce Maclock, who was really the spark that lit the fire that we are going to burn today. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Yeah, I should have made him Master of Ceremonies. He's done very well so far. Right, my name is Bruce Maclock, as Oliver said, and we have a kind of a long, busy, dense, speaker-ridden day. So I have a few administrative remarks that relate to how we'd like the day to unfold. But the first thing I'd like to do is ask David Murray, immediate past president of the Canadian Water Resources Association, to offer their greeting, because those folks stood behind us very firmly while we got this thing underway. So David, please.
Thanks, Bruce. Good morning, everyone. And I just want to welcome you on behalf of the Canadian Water Resources Association. And I bring greetings from President Sean Douglas and the CWA board, who are meeting at this moment. Our board meeting is at the same time of this event, so unfortunately I won't be able to stay with you. This seems much more interesting than an all-day board meeting. But I just wanted to welcome you. And I also want to thank UVic's Polis Project as well, for collaborating with us on this event. And it's also part of our national conference. And I hope that you're sticking around for that. The national conference is entitled Our Common Water Future, Building Resilience Through Innovation. So we just want to thank everybody for being here, thank the speakers and their efforts, and you for attending. And you're going to learn a lot of things today, and I'm sure you have some differing views on things, and this is all part of what CWA does best, which is pulling together diverse groups, having a discussion, facilitating a discussion on what the best course forward is. CWA has been around since about 1948. It might even be longer than Bruce, I'm not sure. But Bruce is a past president many years back. So we have lots of connections across the country. There's about 800 members across Canada, and we have branches in virtually every province. We have a board meeting today with members from each province. We're nonpartisan, we're nonprofit, we're charity, and we facilitate discussion. So this is what the type of things we like to do. So we're really excited about this day, and it's an excellent program that's been put together. CWA also has sustainability principles for water management in Canada, and I'm gonna leave you today with a quote from our sustainability principles. Right in our website. Water is a precious and finite natural entity which is essential to all life and vital to ecological, economic, social, and spiritual well-being. Yet water is often wasted and degraded. Therefore, we face both individual and collective responsibilities to use and manage water wisely. So this will not only be accomplished as we recognize the intrinsic value of water, and we need to practice conscious and committed stewardship, recognizing that this precious heritage must be safeguarded for future generations. And I think that statement is really embodied in what you're doing here today. So I'm going to wish you well on your symposium. Unfortunately, I can't stay with you today, but once again, welcome on behalf of CWA.
Thank you very much, Dave. Before we get onto the substance of the conference, today's symposium, I'd like to ask Elders May Sam to offer a greeting from her First Nation and a small prayer as appropriate. May. Where would you like to be?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Haishka, thank you for being here this morning. Like many of us, we have so much to do in our life. There's family and then work. And being here, you've committed yourself to come be here for the day to learn more. The Columbia River Symposium. Haishka. My traditional name is Switstisia. I'm from the Malahat First Nations where I was born. And my English name is May Sam. I love to tell the children my name is not April or June, it's May. And I just like to see them smile. And I tell them, you call me great grandma, that's okay. But you know how important it is for water? It's like I grew up by the Cowichan River in Duncan. And I had to, as a little child, I had to use 2 buckets to go and get water at the river. And by the time I packed it home, half of it was spilled out before I'd get home. And it was hard work in those days. We had to pack water and put it in a tub and my auntie would make fire to heat the water to wash wool. And we always Dad had this big wooden barrel in the corner of the house, behind the house. And he'd always catch the rainwater so that when we were tired to go get water to do the dishes, we'd go and get a pan full and put it on the cook stove. But we had to make fire. We didn't have electricity in our home. We didn't have plumbing in our home. So we had to get water, heat the water. And this was way back, in, as far back as I can remember, early 1950s. So it's a real blessing for a raindrop. When that last summer, when that big fire was happening, and all our loved ones, people that were losing their homes in that fire, I was praying for them. And I was looking at my dishwater, and I'd put it in a dishpan. And I often wondered what my neighbors thought of me. What is that crazy old lady doing now, you know? But I'd always take my water, my dishwater, I'd pack it outside and I'd spill it out in my plum tree. I didn't want to waste that dishwater down the sink because made it waited till it got cold, had soap in there, so I made use of it. I recycled it, took it outside, even though it was hard work. But I loved to do that all summer last year because it was so hot. You know, the prayer I'm going to do today is for you. I'm going to say the prayer in my language. It's so important to ask the Creator for a blessing in our first language. My first language was Hulkamenum from Cowichan. And I really love to say the prayer first, to speak to the Creator. And I try to remember everything to translate it in English after. Sometimes I forget the most important part in English, but I want you to know that I did ask for the blessing for you, your family, extended family. My prayers for my husband. He's going through, they dropped me off here. He's going to Jubilee for dialysis 3 days a week. So, and I'm here with you, but I'm sorry I have to leave. I'm with 12 students from Esquimalt today. They do house visits, and they've been learning how to weave at my house. So today they're picking me up. I have to text them and tell them where I am. And they're taking me to a farm. So there I'm going to share my teachings with them at the farm today. You know, it's hard talking to young people today. They don't have it hard like we did, like I did when I was young. It gave me the backbone to stand up to be where I am today. The life and teachings, traditional teachings that I received from my loved ones. I didn't have a mom. She took off and left me when I was 4 months old. And my father was the greatest man ever. His name was Everest, and he was tall and handsome, just like the mountain I look at and I pray when I look at Mount Everest. He was the greatest person ever. And he took me way up the bush when he was falling trees. He'd climb the tree with his corkscrew and his leather belt, and he'd cut every branch down and fall that tree. He'd holler at me, "May, nem Italy." He says, "May, go away up there." So we had to move away before the tree went down. Nowadays, if anything happened, anything like that, the welfare, human resources would take us away. I was really blessed and I was really lucky to be with my dad. The teachings I got from him. With his knitting after work, he'd knit. And you look in Cowichan Knitting Maysam in your computer, and you'll get a lot of information about a lot of things I've shared. And my daughter says, "Mom, did you know you're on oh, I forget what you call it. What do you call that anyway? That's got all that internet. Yeah. And I didn't realize, everything that our loved ones have shared that's in there. So I'm going to do my prayer. I'm supposed to be here to do my prayer. I always get carried away. I really get carried away in sharing a lot, how precious water is. And I want to say, Haishka. Haishka, thank you. Thank you for listening to me. And I know you have a long day, but I pray that you're going to be able to be here for the whole day and really look at everything before you. Technology is so wonderful today. I don't want to learn anything about the computer. I'm far too busy. I can't learn the computer. I don't want to. I have my cell phone. I forgot to turn it off. I better turn it off before I do my prayer. And yeah, okay now. So the prayer and the song is for you. Say, Haishka. Kunamaksnas man, say Timanas, say Tisanders praise, Lordum stay. Masi, Haich, Latitel Siem, Tana Nater. Haich, Latitel Siem, Tana Skoleut, Tana Matulia. Haich, Latitel Siem, Kusni, Chulalamati, Zetu with the Mug, Isili. The Thesiais, Mux Quaili, Mux Nit, Masi. I praise and I thank the Creator for a beautiful morning. I ask the Creator for a blessing for each and every brother and sister here with us today, that you're truly going to take care of them and watch over them and guide them and give them a helping hand in their heart. I praise and I thank you. And also to remember the ancestors that were here before us, to truly thank them and have them watch over you and take care of you. No harm is going to come before you in your stay here in the University of Victoria. And also to remember a blessing for the land that we walk on here in this wonderful territory. Lukonen Songhis Husainich Tamuch Squaimal Songhis Saanich territory. I praise and I thank you. A blessing for you and your immediate family. A blessing for each and every one of your loved ones, to help them in each and every way. A blessing for all of you. And this song is for you, to give you strength throughout the morning until all day and all night, to help you. Haishka. Merci, Aishkatit. I praise and I thank the Creator for a blessing. All the blessings you seek for flows through your heart. In your prayer, it reaches your loved ones that is in need, in deep need of a blessing today. Haishra. Kunemaksnas kan say Timonas, hey, Tisandra spray, Slaughter's Day. And also a blessing for the students come through these doors into this wonderful building. A helping hand for each and every one of the staff that come and do their daily work to take care of and help each and every one. Haishra, Haishra.
May, thank you very much. A little gift. Thank you again, May. I mentioned that I had a few housekeeping remarks. I'd just like to get straight into those. I think you all know the washrooms are back at the back of the building and as you came in. There are 2 coffee breaks today, one at 10:30 and one in the middle of the afternoon. I'd like to thank the province of British Columbia for sponsoring that first one, and I think it's the BC Real Estate Foundation sponsored the second one. This, as Dave Murray mentioned, this symposium was organized by a group of people, quite a collection, and it wouldn't have come off without Oliver Brandis's group, the Polish group, and the CWRA staff in Ottawa, and some local folks here too. We originally had it in mind to run the conference or the symposium inside the CWRA conference downtown, but felt that the room here was much more suited, and so we came here. And thanks to Oliver being our host, we now have this room. Today's endeavor, we'd like to underline, is a science and knowledge gathering endeavor, and the small band of fertile criminal minds that put this together, 4 or 5 of us, really want to emphasize that we are not aligned with any particular viewpoint. We just want the science on the table. And so forgive us for organizing a pretty dense day with not a lot of questioning after each session, but we want to hear from you folks, and we do have an hour set aside at the very end, and hope that can suffice as a question and answer discussion period. You may feel a little bit crowded for time as as the moderators try and, if you like, move us along quickly. So forgive us for that. We discovered when we looked at the whole realm of the Columbia River Treaty renegotiation possibilities that there's an awful lot of stuff that has to be done. And so we only just hit the high points by persuading speakers like our first one sitting beside me, Barb Cousins from Idaho, to help us with this. So anyway, it's a long day, and please have patience with the moderators. If you find after one paper that you don't have a question or don't have room in that 5-minute period or so for a question, write your question down and give it to the moderator. And the questions can be written down on pieces of paper, index cards that Mike is holding there. And each moderator, the first moderator, for example, is John O'Riordan down on my right. In this first session, for example, take your questions and give them to John, and do the same in the next session, and so on. The moderators will gather them all together and take a look at them, see which ones are similar, and prioritize them a bit, and get them ready for that last question and answer, period. This session is being recorded through some clever magic, I'd say webcasting technology, so many people in the interior of BC or anybody that wanted to tune in could. And there is we're not able to offer internet access in this room today. I think that's about all I really want to do. I want to quickly as possible, it's 9 o'clock, move to John and get on with the session. Have I missed anything, Mike? Oh, yes. The Ministry of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources for the province of British Columbia is a fundamental reason why we're able to get speakers to come. They have done a great deal in ponying up to pay for speaker travel. I'd like to thank them profusely and move on. Okay, my first moderator is John O'Riordan, and he's going to introduce the first session.
So can I ask the speakers to join me at the head table? I should mention off the bat, in case you get confused, that Rich Moy, who is the member at the American side of the IJC, and supposed to be speaking second in this panel, unfortunately he was unable to be here today because he broke some ribs on the weekend and wasn't able to drive from Montana to Victoria with broken ribs. But he and I have collaborated on a chapter in a book on the history of the IJC, which is being coordinated by the Murray Clemens of the Secretariat to the IJC. And that book is forthcoming and will be published in approximately 6 months. And so Rich has asked me to present on his behalf. So I have the distinguished honor of being both moderator and speaker at the same panel, so it's quite a challenge. Anyway, I'd like to welcome my panelists to the meeting. We're going to go straight to the talk so we can maximize the amount of time taken in presenting, and then we'll have a short question period after each panelist. So the first one is Barb Cousins, and I've known Barb now for about 3 or 4 years since I personally became involved in the Columbia. And she was telling me last night that she has herself been extensively involved in the Columbia Treaty since, I think, about 2009. So she's she's written extensively on the treaty, and probably the most well-versed on all of its nuances of any practicing academic that I know of. And she has the unique ability to speak for both the Canadian interests and the American interests. So she's totally bilingual. And without any ado, I'd like to invite Barb to make her presentation.
Thank you, John. I'd like to thank the organizers. This is a fabulous lineup for this gathering. I'd also like to acknowledge the Coast Salish as the original owners of this land, and also, since today in the U.S. is Memorial Day, I would like to acknowledge all those who have given their lives for both of our countries over the years. So my task today is to give sort of the history of the treaty, the review process, and outline the issues that separate or at least appear to separate the U.S. and Canada coming out of the regional review. We don't really know where they're at as they go into the negotiations, which start tomorrow. And so I'm going to do all of that in 15 to 20 minutes. So let's get going. So, did you?
Can you lower the mic, just take the whole arm and get it down
So that it's not in my forehead?
you might have to undo it down there.
There we go. Short people, yeah. They didn't make podiums for us. So the treaty, initially, both countries had asked the International Joint Commission to begin studying how the two countries could have joint benefits from development of the Columbia River. But what really catalyzed it was a major flooding event in 1948. And in that year, the snowpack was about what it was this year. And we saw flooding in the Okanagan this year, but not on the Columbia River. And that's probably largely due to the dams. But also what happened in 1948 is you had a very rapid warming event in May and a rain-on-snow event. And what that does is brings all the snowmelt off at once. And so just remember this number because I'll refer back to it. The estimated flow at the Dalles, which is the point they kind of use as a reference for measurement because it's downstream on the Columbia from where the major tributaries come in. And it's along the border between Washington and Oregon. The flow estimated there was 1 million cubic feet per second. And a major community near Portland was wiped out, Vanport, that the pictures here are of. There was major flooding in Trail, BC, and other communities within British Columbia, and that really catalyzed it. Nevertheless, it still took until 1964 when we finally had a treaty enter into force. And what they had decided is that there were two benefits that could be shared from development of the Columbia River: hydropower and flood control. And so in the treaty, there was agreement that 3 dams would be built in Canada, the 3 that are shown here. In between Mica and Keenleyside, there is a re-regulating reservoir called Revelstoke. That's not a treaty dam, but it has to be operated consistent with the treaty. The treaty also allowed but did not require Libby Dam to be built in the U.S. They had to have agreement to allow that because it backs water up into British Columbia. The United States paid Canada $65 million for what's called assured flood control for 60 years. So that's a very conservative operation of the river, use of dams in Canada to prevent flooding downstream in both British Columbia and in the United States. So $65 million for 60 years. Because the power that's produced from release of dams in Canada and run through hydropower production in the United States, that is shared 50-50 between the US and Canada. That's called the Canadian entitlement, and I'll explain that a little bit more later. But at the time, Canada did not need that power. And so in the negotiation that took place between 1961 and 1964 between the province and the federal government of Canada, one of the things that the province asked for was upfront sale of some of that power. And so they entered into contracts for sale of that back to the United States for use in the Southwest for 30 years for around $250 million. And so Congress in the US authorized what's called the Northwest-Southwest Intertie, which basically was the grid that connected the Pacific Northwest to the Southwest so that power sale could be viable. And then what was authorized under the treaty were the appointment of the operating entities. So the US side appointed 2 people the head of Bonneville Power, and the Northwest Division engineer of the Army Corps. And Canada appointed an entity, BC Hydro. So when you hear reference to the entities, these are the entities, the operators, the implementers of that treaty. Well, why has that treaty, for its production of hydropower and for its approach to sharing benefits across an international boundary, has been held throughout the world as a model of transboundary treaties. But why is it under review, and why do negotiations start tomorrow? Well, the one thing that changes, the main thing, is that assured flood control that I said was paid for by $65 million. That expires September 16th, 2024. And the other thing that is triggered by that date in the treaty is, under international law, Canada and the US could have sat down at any point in the past 50 years and negotiated a change in the treaty. But what the treaty, by its provisions, allows is unilateral termination of the treaty. One country or the other can walk away. Earliest time they can do that is September 16th, 2024, and they have to give 10 years notice. So we're within that 10-year period before 2024. No notice has been given so far. Neither country has chosen to walk away from the treaty at this point. Well, that's all that happens. That's all that's changing. So the question is, why has the review been so broad? Why are there so many issues on the table? Well, that's because even though there are some things that never change, there are a number of things that have changed since 1964 that affect the treaty. First of all, energy demand. We thought in 1964 in both countries we had this very rapid rise in energy demand following World War II. And we thought that straight line would continue, and therefore hydropower would be our peaking power at this point, and we would be reliant on thermal power, primarily nuclear. And what that means then is if you're only using hydropower for peaking, it's far less valuable. And so we thought that the Canadian entitlement, the benefits to the US of shared operation, would not be so great. Instead, we all know what happened. We had the energy crisis of the 70s, the oil embargo. We learned that we could conserve our way out of new power plants. And the result is that even in the 20-year plan for the basin in the US, for electricity for the basin in the US, we anticipate hydropower to remain our base load, so our very valuable source of power. And the renewables that are already licensed are enough to meet that demand 20 years in advance. So we did go in that direction. Climate change, another changer in the basin, and what you see on this, on your left, the light-colored map of the basin shows that predictions are that we won't have huge changes in water supply. But the big red map, the big ugly red map, that shows what happens to vegetative demand for water as temperatures rise. And so what that does is predicts water deficit within the basin simply because of temperatures rising. On the right side, you have already measured changes in the timing of runoff, and that's because particularly at the lower latitudes, our watersheds are changing from snow-dominated to rain-dominated. That's very important when timing of runoff is used to determine how you operate your dams for hydropower. So this and what our energy future is because of technology change have huge areas of uncertainty, and that's one reason people are asking for science advisory panels in order to have a treaty that's more flexible and is informed going forward by science. I think the biggest story in the basin, though, is the capacity of the people in the basin, just shown by the number of people in this room and the number of people who've signed up for this and those listening on webcasts. Since 1964, there have been a number of organizations and legal changes within the basin that have given people within the basin more power. So in the US, the Northwest Power and Conservation Council does the Energy Planning and Fish and Wildlife Program. It's composed of a compact between the 4 main states, Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. Similar to that, within the basin, you have the Columbia Basin Trust, authorized to receive hydropower revenues in 1995, and they do a considerable amount of education within the basin and economic development planning, as well as planning on climate change. You have the Bolt decision in the US in the 1970s, which recognized the treaty fishing rights of the tribe, and that has really given rise to the tribes as co-managers of fisheries in the basin, and highly sophisticated science and policy agencies helping them give a voice to tribal management of fisheries. The Constitution Act in Canada, 1982, requires consultation with First Nations. So rising empowerment of tribes and First Nations on both sides of the border. And that really became evident during the review process in the participation of the 15 tribes on the US side of the border. In 2010, they came forward with a document called the Common Views on the Future of the Columbia River Treaty. And through the review process in the US, in which the 15 tribes were represented by 5 people on a sovereign review team, and the 4 states were represented by 1 person each on the sovereign review team, the tribes brought to the table the desire to elevate ecosystem function to a 3rd prong of the treaty, and that came through in the regional review. So that just shows you the paradigm shift in empowerment of voices within the basin that have brought other issues to the table. Also, the legal landscape has changed for Canadian First Nations, and you have going from rulings that say that Aboriginal title did survive settlement and colonization to more recent rulings in the Chilcotin ruling that says that even when that interest is only a claim, consultation has to occur, and there needs to be a sliding scale depending on the claim to an actual realized recognition of native title on the land. The other thing that's changed in the basin is we realized as the dams were being built in the US between the 30s and the 70s and the treaty dams in Canada all the way up through the 70s, that these would affect the ecological system within the basin. What has changed is that we care. So the map of the basin shows in kind of ironically salmon color the part of the basin that is now blocked from salmon migration by dams, and that's about 37% of the former spawning habitat within the basin. The lighter pink were blocked by natural features. You see up in the upper right the listings of species in the US within the basin. In Canada, in the main stem, of course, Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph in the US block anadromous fish from getting into the main stem, but you do have anadromous fish going up the Okanagan in Canada. And so that passage of the Endangered Species Act, the Species at Risk Act in Canada, illustrates the rising value that people have put on the ecosystem. And finally, the lower graph shows the change in the hydrograph. That was done on purpose in order to be able to produce hydropower and even out the spring freshet. But that also slows the migration of smolts from the headwaters out to sea. And that has changed the survival rates of salmon. Okay, so given all those changes and all those issues that people bring to the table, the US and British Columbia underwent regional reviews from 2010 to 2013, and you just see on this slide a synopsis of what both sides came out with. Both sides identifying similar issues, but having subtle differences. And what I wanted to do in the last few minutes is just explain the subtle differences between the two sides on each of the issues listed here. First of all, we have the Canadian entitlement, and I love this slide because it helps explain it. So you can, of course, tell the little maple leafs are Canadian dams, and every time water is released from one of those dams, it can produce hydropower at every single dam below it. 50% of that added increment of produced hydropower is the Canadian entitlement. The treaty has that delivered to British Columbia, but actually what happens is the bulk of it is sold on the market. Originally it was sold in those 30-year contracts. Now it's sold on the market. It's been as high as $350 million in 1 year for sale, and much lower now with so much natural gas coming onto the market, which I hear you have all kinds of issues about these days. So what the U.S. wants, of course, is to pay less Canadian entitlement, and Canada wants to pay more. What the U.S. says is that we've already paid for the dams. Why do we do this? Well, what the U.S. needs to be reminded is that the fundamental basis of the treaty was not the U.S. paying for the dams. It was shared benefits. The Canadian entitlement reflects shared benefits: release of water upstream, production of power downstream. Canada says we want more. You use that water both for production of hydropower and for ecosystem function. And yet what the US would say is you have harm in Canada from building the dams. We have harm in the US from building the dams. So in both cases, we're talking about mitigation from the use of the dams, not benefits. And so one way to look at this as a matter of diplomacy, you often, if you elevate the dialogue to a higher level, you can kind of start to see ways to resolve differences. And if the US and Canada can think about these negotiations as not only having the fundamental principle of shared benefits, but the fundamental principle of mitigation of harm in both countries, they might be able to reach agreement. Flood control. So remember I said that the flood of 1948 was around 1 million cubic feet per second at the Dalles. Well, the treaty has assured flood control, trying to target a low level of 450,000 CFS as the peak flow at the Dalles. And then fallback provisions, once that expires, of US being able to call upon Canada when the flows are going to reach 600,000 cubic feet per second. Well, it turns out from all the research we've done that those numbers were kind of best guesses. And today, with a period of record, we do not have to any longer rely on best guesses. We have data. And while there may have been studies done, there are not studies that have been released to the public that show what the real level we need is. But I had a student do archival research, and in the 86 times, by the time he did the research, that the flow has exceeded 450,000 CFS, being as high in 1 year as 550,000 CFS, this year 500,000 CFS, we had very minor flooding that could have been handled by either moving parks out of the flood range or by putting in small structural features. So it's quite possible that the difference between the US and Canada can be bridged by science, and that the real level is closer to 550,000 CFS in terms of needs for assured flood control. Ecosystem function. The US review asked that ecosystem function be elevated to a third prong of the treaty. And one of the things about that makes people nervous is ecosystem function exists at many scales. So there are international issues having to do with flow, water quality, meaning temperature, and fish passage across an international boundary. But then there are all the habitat issues that go along with ecosystem function that people do not want to elevate to an international level. Some of the studies that we've done on governance suggest that what you could do is you could mimic other international agreements where you just address those issues that are international and then allow for subnational coordination of issues like habitat restoration. That's another activity that could be easily informed by a scientific body. Well, finally, we are commencing negotiations now, and one of the interesting things when you think of both recommendations saying there should be greater transparency going forward and all of the forums that have been held throughout the basin to do that, neither side has allowed First Nations or tribes or observers at the table. And even in the 1950s and 60s, when there was much less of an expectation of public participation, on the US side, there were congressional observers or their staff in the room for negotiations. So this is a serious difference that people in the basin are starting to organize over. And as negotiations commence tomorrow, I'm sure we will be hearing more about that issue. And so finally, I'll conclude with one of the things that kind of governs the negotiations going forward. We have aging infrastructure in this basin, and we have an opportunity to negotiate to modernize the treaty. This is a chance for reconciliation of ecosystem function with the benefits we have from the basin, from hydropower and from the from flood control, and reconciliation of First Nations and tribal governments with the rest of the people within the basin. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Barb. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask people to, if they've got some questions, to limit them to points of clarification on something they want an urgent answer to, but keep your question very pointed, and then I'll proceed with the next presentation. Have I scared you all off?
I'm working with the flood risk management people in Portland, and there is long-term effect of flows at this level on the flood risk management structures. Whoops.
Okay, did you want to respond? No. Okay, well, I'm going to, I'm standing in for Rich Boy, who is an American representative on the IJC. Rich and I worked together on the Flathead reference to the IJC. The Flathead is a river in eastern Kootenays that crosses the border into Montana. And in the mid-'80s, there was a proposal for a major coal development on a tributary to the Flathead called Sage Creek. And the IGC was asked to review the environmental implications of that. And the commission reported back in the late 80s with a proposal not to proceed with the mine because the environmental effects into the states were too significant. So he and I worked together on that, and as I mentioned in my introductions, we were asked jointly to draft a chapter for the book on the history of the IJC in Canada, and we put together the chapter for British Columbia. So I'm going to be walking through this fairly briefly because some of the slides I'm not that familiar with, but I will talk to the ones that I am familiar with. So we're talking quickly about the history of the IJC relative to the Columbia Basin Treaty, its key functions, which are 3, and we'll come to, and some of the new developments of the IJC as a manager of international waterways, which both Rich and I feel have relevance to support the treaty renegotiation process in the next year. I'm going to skip this one, and I'm going to show you 2 slides which apparently are not photoshopped. So this picture shows the Niagara Falls. I can't remember which year, but when they were doing some maintenance on the falls and they shut the water off completely. So it's actually a historical occurrence. And this one shows the falls today. And I think what Ulrich was pointing out is that the role of the IJC is to make sure that we don't have the picture on the top left, and we always have the picture on the top or bottom right of collaborative management. So there are the whole point of the IJC, which was created by the International Treaty in 1909, is it has two major functions. One is equal opportunity to manage water that crosses a border so that there are equal opportunities for both Americans and Canadians defined in the way they manage the water. So they protect the interests of both nations on an equal basis. And that's Article 8 of the treaty. And Article 4 is the one that triggered the Flathead reference, where the waters shall not be polluted on either side of the border. Okay. So that was the reference. And I should point out that the IJC operates with a reference from the both Canadian and American Departments of State. So they're not an independent agency. They have to be asked to do their work. So there are three types of roles that the IJC plays. One is an application submitted through the two governments to undertake an analysis of boundary treaty water issues. And the biggest one and the longest running one is the Great Lakes Initiative to protect water quality and flows into the Great Lakes on both sides of the border. The second one is where there are specific references where the government asks them to deal with a particular issue. And that was the case of the Flathead. And the third one is where they look at emerging issues on behalf of both governments and bring science to bear on how these issues can be managed in the future. So the principles are that there's equality between the two countries. It's a science-based organization, evidence-based. People who serve on the commission don't serve specifically as their own scientists. They serve more generally in terms of their understanding of science. Decisions are made by consensus. And there's a lot of stakeholder involvement and engagement with First Nations. So it's a very collaborative model of operation. And in every case, in the last 100 or so years, pretty well agreement has been reached in every reference that the IJC has taken. And there's a sliver of blue here. I have no idea which are the ones that didn't succeed, but not in the recent past. I'm going to pass over that. So the commissioners were all appointed under a previous government. So the US commissioners were appointed under President Obama, and the three Canadian commissioners were appointed under Prime Minister Harper. So they haven't been changed as a result of the changes in government by both parties in the last 3 or 4 years. So Rich Moy has been on the commission for 7 years, starting in 2011. And here is a map showing the major international basins that the IGC has had one or other of its involvements, either a reference or an application to apply its science. So they've pretty well crossed the entire border from east to west. And you'll see the Columbia Basin in the second last of the basins in BC. So the role of the IGC in the developing the, I'm going to skip this because I've covered this largely, is the IGC was asked after the floods that Barb talked about. It started the negotiations for the original treaty in the 1950s. That the IGC was asked in 1944 to undertake the technical studies that provided the science and technical analysis behind the sequence of dams that were produced by in the treaty, the 3 dams in Canada, including the Libby Dam. So all of the technical analysis was done by IGC through a joint engineering board. And they did a tremendous amount of work, and I think it's fair to say that the treaty could not have been developed without the role of the IJC over that 10-year period. And there was actually consensus as a result of all of that work, and so there was a fairly straightforward negotiation once the reports were completed by Canada and the US to come to a conclusion on the Columbia Treaty. In fact, the treaty was signed in principle in 1961, 2 years after the submission of the final technical reports by the IGC, and it was ratified in 1964. So that's actually, given today's world, a fairly quick ratification. So I think we've covered a lot of this one. I'm going to come to the areas of innovation that Rich wanted me to talk to, because the IJC continues to evolve as a science-based body to provide advice to the governments on all international water issues. And an example in Great Lakes in 2012, the Water Quality Agreement was radically changed in terms of its governance to broaden a range of analysis undertaken from primary nutrient pollution and water quality to include groundwater, habitat change, and climate change too. So the remit of the IJC has evolved as a result of the historical development of issues in the Great Lakes. And then, more importantly, the governance structure has broadened to include both science. So there's two scientific panels, one of scientists who are independent, either consultants or academics from universities, and another one which is a group of scientists from government agencies, both state and local governments, both in the American and Canadian systems. So in the Great Lakes, there's a very broad-based, independent and agency-based science body that advises the commissioners on the management of the Great Lakes Basin. The other thing is that the Commission is broadening its approach to other basins across Canada, looking at ecosystem management as a component of water management. So it's taking a more holistic view than was the case in the earlier years of its mandate. It's spending a lot of time on harmonizing data and the quality of data between within each of the jurisdictions, Americans and the Canadians, and between the jurisdictions, so that the water quality, the water data are more robust and useful to both countries. They've also brought in some strong liaison with local governments, particularly in Lake of the Woods and the Rainy River, so that there's much more bottom-up advice than top-down advice than was the case in the past. And they've developed a broader shared vision of evolving issues in these basins. So Richie's idea is the role of the IJC, or an equivalent of the IJC, should be provided to supplement the work of the negotiating teams. So he feels strongly that the IJC has ability to attract science from all ranges of life to deal with the issues outlined by Barb in the renegotiated treaty, and set up a binational science panel that can provide independent advice to the negotiators. And these would include a holistic approach to the basin. So the current model is the Columbia River Treaty, because it actually deals only with the Columbia River. It doesn't deal with the Columbia Basin, which is a much bigger entity and includes the Okanagan-Similkameen, for example. So one of the roles that the IGC could play would be to broaden some of the issues that are in the basin rather than limited to the river itself. They would certainly have the capacity to advise on salmon management and the restoration of salmon in the system. They have a good track record of engaging with scientists at the First Nations and in local communities. So they could build a more robust science model to advise the negotiators. They now have a good understanding of changing climate changing hydrology and how that affects future flows and developing scenarios of hydrology that have to be addressed as the climate changes. And they have the capacity, if people want it, to develop and bring together a group of prominent scientists from both sides of the border to look on a common basis at the way the Columbia might be managed in the future and bring independent science to the advice and knowledge of the communicators. So I want to leave that there because it's a theme that I'll be returning to on my own presentation in the next panel. And it's also a theme that, as from my own past history, I think has a lot of resonance in helping to complete a modernized treaty. So thanks very much for your attention. I'm not sure if I can answer any questions. I'm not Rich Moy, but if anyone has anything I can pass on. Okay, well then I will ask Chief Wayne Christian to come to the table. So Wayne is the chief of the Swamp First Nation, which covers the Upper Columbia and parts of the Shuswap. So it's one of the three tribal groupings in the Columbia. And he has the vast experience in working with the government and with the local provincial Columbia Advisory Committee in giving advice to the BC government on the way the treaty should be developed. So it's a great pleasure that you get his first experience on the role of the treaty going forward.
Waiko Haitap. Hello, everyone. Kalmuk's Quest Winopteen. My Indian name is Big Voice That Speaks the Truth. It comes from my great-great-grandfather. And Jao Kukpi Spalatina, I'm the chief of the people of Splatsin of the Soquapam Nation. I'm also one of the tribal chiefs of the Soquapam Nation. I first want to acknowledge the ancestors of the territory and the present-day descendants, and the elder this morning, Mary Sam, that gave a real example of what I call our traditional ecological experts that know the history and know the land and know everything about it in the song. That song was a powerful song. If you were listening to it, you could kind of just feel going back, years and years. It just was a powerful process. So I want to acknowledge the people here because they've been here for 10,000 years and more, just like our people have been where we have been. My original presentation I was asked, and I really want to thank the organizers for inviting me here, was actually on Soquapam law. I was doing a real nice PowerPoint and getting all that ready with pictures so you didn't have to listen to me talk. You could look at the screen. But then on May 17th, an announcement happened. As you know, that Canada told our people, our negotiators at the table, that we were not going to be at the negotiating table with the US, nor would we even be in the room. And this unilateral decision, how can I explain this, is a fundamental betrayal. We see it in terms of good faith that we've been working with Canada and British Columbia on the Columbia River Treaty since 2011. And it really has demonstrated to us that this decision to exclude the Soquapam, the Tanaka, and the Syilx, the Okanagan, is contrary to international law and the recognition in Canadian law that the title and rights holders have a right to consent to any activities on our land, and including the Columbia River system. So it's important, what I'm going to talk about today is just sort of some of those issues, because it's, I can't explain the betrayal you feel that you have a prime minister that's been advocating internationally and speaking at the United Nations about nation to nation, the right, recognition, blah, 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 partnership, and it was an opportune time for him to actually do something. And the minister, and the surprising thing for us was we got it in a text message to the negotiator for Canada, and he read it out. that kind of sort of process, it's kind of really demeaning and then really insulting to us as, the title and rights holders of that part of the world and as nations of people. We're not Indian bands, we're nations of people because we've not ceded, sold, nor surrendered our lands or water. So I think it's important in that context, what I'm speaking about today in terms of what we need to do. And I see there's some Silks people here. The Okanagan are represented here today, and really important. I don't know if there's any Tanaka here as well, but we're coming together to decide what to do later this week because they're, as you know, starting the negotiations tomorrow. So in 1964, when the Columbia River Treaty came into effect, I was 10 years old. And I can remember as a child walking around a little town I grew up in, or grew up around, Enderby, and seeing signs in restaurants that said no dogs or no Indians. And I didn't understand what that meant in terms of the racism and how we were excluded from things like eating, right? So today, the signs in Washington, in DC, and Ottawa just says no Indians. Specifically, no Soquapam, no Tanaka, no Silks. We're not allowed in the room. And so it's important to understand that concept. It's really at the foundation of this. We still see this, the doctrine of discovery at work and the whole process of how Canada sees itself as our, how do you put it, big brother and looking after us. We're not wards of the state. We are a nation of people. And it's really important Canada, specifically Prime Minister Trudeau, Minister Freeland, and also Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould should know this, that we are Indigenous and we're sovereign in our lands. We've not ceded, sold, nor surrendered those lands or waters. And it's important. I'll keep saying that over and over because it's critical to where we're going. The Silcotin decision, which was mentioned in earlier presentations in 2014, really talked a lot about the actual title and how that was done. One of the important pieces in that Supreme Court decision was it struck down the doctrine of terra nullius, which is the doctrine of the land is empty. It struck down in that Supreme Court decision. If you read through it, you can see it says right there in law. And I think that's an important understanding because and the other important part of that Supreme Court decision was it talked about consent. I think it's mentioned probably 60 to 70 times in the actual decision, consent, 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 consent. And it's really, really important. It appears, though, that the Prime Minister didn't get the memo on the doctrine of terra nullius, the land is empty. It appears that he seems to ignore his own law. And that's the problem with lawmakers is they ignore their own law. In 1910, our ancestors said it in this way. What happens is you get one law for the rich white people, one law for the poor white, yet another law for the Indian, and how it's enforced on us. And that's what we see in the dynamics that's going on in Canada because of the doctrine of discovery. So I think you need to have that context in terms of how we sort of move forward on this. Our Secwepemc laws and the laws of the interior tribes, these go back thousands of years through our oral history. In our oral history, it ties us to the rivers and to the systems, specifically the Columbia River system. It was recorded in the 1900s by James Tate. It talked about how the coyote freed that salmon at the Portland and brought the salmon up the Columbia River. And understanding that the salmon has a real important part of our culture. And so it ties us all along the river in terms of that creation story and how salmon came to be for our people. The Columbia River system was really important. And so I think in understanding that, you have to understand that the actual Western science has proven this and proven it with our oral history. They go alongside it, that geology and corroborated with geology and biology, that the things we talk about in our oral history can actually be corroborated with your science. And it's becoming more and more known in terms of, we just released a book that talked about Secwepemc laws, land, and people. And I think so I talk about our traditional ecological experts or knowledge experts have that knowledge and it's been passed down for thousands of years. And that's what our law is passed down in that way, and it's really important. Because we're doing work here at the University of Victoria with the law program around our Indigenous laws. We've been working on this for a while now. And I think it's important to understand the concepts. It's not foreign. We have laws. We are a people that had laws. We had customs, we had a language, we had lands, et cetera, et cetera. We weren't nomadic and wandering around. We actually were a society that was really quite organized, and I think it's important. So I think that in itself, when you talk about the whole concept of the Columbia Basin, you have to understand that there was two stories. There's one, the story about the salmon coming up the Columbia River, but also there's the one on the Thompson River. And where the Thompson River actually once flowed all through, I think you know, those of you that know this stuff, it just flowed all through the Columbia River at one time until the ice dam about 10,000 years ago. And that's the story about coyote bringing up the salmon from that part. And still today, the genetics of the coho salmon specifically are genetically tied to the Columbia River that come up the Thompson, the North and South Thompson River. And also the kasu, the spring salmon that we fish in our area, are genetically linked to the Columbia River. So you can see that when we say these things, it's not like it's a myth and it's something that's out of thin air. It's something that we can corroborate with our own, and your science corroborates it with your science. And so our laws are really important to show that we've been here for a while. And I think it's really, really critical to the whole process, because I think that we have to understand that the foundation of who we are and our interaction with this specific agreement is really based on our laws and the fact we've not sold, ceded, nor surrendered our lands, resources, or our people. And you've got to keep understanding that. That's really, really important in terms of this whole process. So it's been talked a little bit about the issue of the current shifting dynamics that was mentioned in the first presentation around the law. You know, the issue of the ownership of our lands, which the courts are calling Aboriginal title. And it's interesting concepts because in Canadian law, it's been confirmed that it gives us the right to use, control the land, and enjoy its benefits. Not only right now, but into the future. Really, in the Silcotin decision, it talked about making sure we made decisions in the use of that land for future generations, because that's a principle we have. And in the Silcotin decision, it talks about that. And so it's really important. And it also says we don't have to prove our title and rights in court. Again, those rights are recognized and affirmed in Canada's Constitution. And I think that's really important, and we need to protect and enforce our rights. And this is the interesting part. You've heard Canada and you've heard British Columbia talk about the endorsement and implementing UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the heart of that whole recognition is the right of self-determination. We have a people in Article 3 and 4 talks about the right of self-determination. And I think at the heart of all this process is it's an opportune time, and that's why we're a bit stunned that Canada wouldn't step up and say, yeah, come into the room with us as we recognize you as who you are, as you originally had organized yourself as nations. And that's what's so stunning about this to us, is that it's really kind of interesting. And it really includes in the court decisions and the UNDRIP about free, prior, and informed consent, and the right to be involved in all decision-making involving our people and our land, because it's still our lands, it's still our river. It's not gone away. Nobody's, you know, even though it's assumed jurisdiction over the past 150 years, remember, we've been here for 10,000 years. We're not going away. And it's really important that Canada come to grips with that, and that I think British Columbia as well, they're starting to. We see more and more of it happening, and I'm interested to see what the minister has to say about all of this, because it's interesting in terms of where things are going in terms of Indigenous people. Canada will ultimately have to seek free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous nations in the interior. And what does that mean? And I think really what it is they really, in order for it to be free, it's not free. And what I mean by that is they have to provide adequate resources so we can actually do our own evaluation You know, and that's the big problem, is that they keep treating us as sort of off the side of the desk. They don't treat us and give us the resources so we can respond properly, and they wonder why we don't engage and we don't actually make good decisions, because we're not given the resources to actually make those good decisions. So in fact, with our own timeframes and without external pressure to conclude a deal, because that's always the thing. We give you money, we want you to do something for us, and it can't be that. It can't be that way. If they truly want consent, then they have to provide adequate resources, and in terms of free consent, and that's what that is. And it's got to be enough time and notice to our people to understand the issues. Because for us, we've got 10,000, 15,000 Secwepemc people, and the way we're structured is there's no central governing authority. It's really governed by regions, it's governed by families. And so we have to find a way that this process goes into our governance system and gets consent. It's not done by band councils. Band councils are an extension of Indian Affairs, an extension of the federal government. So there has to be a different process. And so we have to have time, because this is what Canada and British Columbia destroyed. They attacked our governance system, our families. We governed our people, our lands and water and everything through our families. That's how we governed the territory. They attacked that. They attacked our children. They went to war against our children, our families. They destroyed that governance system on the land. They took us off that and put us on reserves. You have to have permission to leave the reserve. Anyways, I get pretty angry about that. I'm still angry about it because I see the devastating impact of this. So they have to really understand that they need to resources to get our families rebuilt and reorganized and govern our territory again. That's what this is about for us. It's about helping Canada and British Columbia helping rebuild what they destroyed by their law. Legislative genocide is what I call it. They use their laws to kill us. And you think about today with all the children in care, more than in the state than there ever was in residential schools. Thousands of children under the laws of the provinces with consent of the federal government. And we're not involved. Think about that for a minute. This is 2018. This is not 1900s or 1867. This is 2018. Things have to change. So really, consent really will be about that and getting relevant issues on the table for us. Heard some of it, ecosystem function, the return of the salmon, and we can get into that debate. I think it's really important. But we have four sort of strategies or four key priorities that we see as important. The first one is the one river approach. In all the dialogue I've heard about the Columbia River Treaty, people seem to forget the Columbia River, first and foremost, is a river. It's water. They forget that all the things you're talking about in terms of the science and everything really boils down to water. Either there's more water or less water. And then the whole issue of flood control and how that water has created an economic, in the lower 40, across the border, an economic prosperity for the United States. And I think you have to understand, water is critical to our survival as a people. You know, we're taught very clearly that, that life begins with that single drop of rain when it hits the top of those mountains. And it goes down, it feeds the whole mountain all the way down, right down into the creeks and lakes and rivers and into the ocean, and then it cycles back. It's just what it does. It's this natural cycle. Our people, we were taught that, how important water is. And so the Columbia River is really important, that we have to really consider the cumulative effects of what's going on. You know, since this has been set up, the ecology, the ecosystem function of the river, in terms of what that means. It's not just about flood control, and it's not just about hydrogeneration, it's about the animals, it's about the fish, it's about the people, it's about the medicines, it's about everything along that river that sustains life through that water. It's critical to the function of us as a people in this part of the world. It's really, really important. And in the One River approach, restoration of natural flows is really important. You know, restoration of the salmon to the upper Columbia River. You know, our people in the Shuswap Indian Band, when they shut down originally, the first dam that went up was the Grand Coulee. And the federal government showed up with cases of spam to give to the people there and to say that this is what you're going to get because you've lost your salmon as spam. Think about that, you know. They're trading something that's culturally, spiritually, and has a real significance in our culture and our language and who we are, and to give us a can of spam. How is that relevant? How are you going to teach a child to catch that can of salmon or a can of spam? How are you going to teach them to spear it, to net it, the songs that go with that? You know what I mean? Think about it. Really, really important, because salmon is so important to our people. It's our survival. What took us in our creation stories off the desolate land, and the Creator brought them to us and fed us and sustained life in us and gave us life. Anyways, it's just, I get really passionate about this stuff. The other thing is that a priority is that we in the interior are really coming together as one voice. You know, we have a lot of differences in terms of our interpretation of things, but I think with the recent announcement, it's really going to push us to seek ways to come together that we've never ever done before. And Canada, and I thank Canada for that in some ways, it's really disheartening what they've done, but I think they've given us an opportunity to do something collectively. And you'll see that in the coming weeks and months in terms of what we're going to do, because we'll be speaking with one voice, and it's really important. The other priority we had was a seat at the table. And that, you know, I know Canada, and I was talking with Ken earlier this morning, is that they're going to be talking with us and, yeah, have that consultation with us, but we won't be at the actual table. That'll just be with Canada. We have a hard time sending somebody into a negotiating process that we don't trust. And that's what's happened with this latest decision. We really don't trust Canada. Everything we've ever seen from Canada has led to us as a people being excluded, either by law or by process. And so I think it's really, really important. The whole issue of, it's no longer about consultation, it's about consent. Consultation as a process is dead. We have to look at consent is the way forward with this whole process. Is really, really important. The other aspects that we look at as a priority is economic compensation. In 1910, our chiefs in the memorial to Swofford Laurier were very clear that we would share everything, and with the newcomers in our land, the settlers come into our territory, we would share everything equally. I'm going to paraphrase here. We will share everything equally and treat you as brothers. What is yours is mine, and what is mine is yours. We will share everything 50-50, and that's what it says in 1910. The concept of reciprocal accountability. And so it's really important in terms of the issue of the Columbia River is that we have not seen any benefits from this process, any economic benefits. The downstream benefits are there. The territory has been so severely impacted. We've never ever received compensation for the initial sort of damage that was done and what happened with our burial sites, our village sites, the migration of moose, caribou. All of those things our people relied on, all those things were disrupted, and there was nothing ever done to deal with those past processes. You know, in British Columbia alone has received hundreds of millions in cash since the treaty came into effect in 1964. You know, where's the Indigenous portion? Where can we actually point to that this is actually there? And we say if 1,100 square kilometers of our tidal lands have been flooded, would we receive 1,100 square kilometers of different land in return? You know, these are the things we're talking about. The Columbia Basin Trust that was set up by the provincial government, and I believe it's Premier Horgan actually was working on this once upon a time, that it had very little input from us in terms of setting it up. And I think the Tanaka have a representative on the board, but the other two nations were not engaged in that process. And we've not received benefits the way the non-Indigenous local governments have. They've received millions of dollars to create infrastructure in their communities, cultural, recreation, et cetera, our communities have not seen that same kind of benefit. So I think it's really important that the Columbia Basin Trust has really invested a lot in the region, but not in our communities. And I think that's when we talk about economic benefit that we really need to sort of get involved in that. Down in the U.S., the shipping industry in the U.S. transport more than $12 billion annually in the lower portion of the Columbia. $12 billion annually. And agriculture in the U.S. has benefited by $5 billion where our lands were flooded. So I really think that the economic considerations is important. And I guess in closing, those of you that believe that we should be there at the table and part of the nation-to-nation process that's been widely advertised right across Canada, I urge you to write Prime Minister Trudeau, Minister Freeland, Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, and tell her to get us involved, get us at that table, and to recognize their commitments they've made publicly and they're going to make in law with Bill 262 that's going into legislation, the implementation of federal law for the recognition of UNDRIP. So again, I thank for the opportunity to be here with you today and to give you our perspective. It would have been a different presentation if the announcement on the 17th didn't happen. I would have given you more in-depth around the actual, our law on the land and water and what it means. So again, I thank you for your time.
I'm very glad you came, Chief. It was a wonderful exposition of what has happened in the past and so important for us all to hear. And we will be following up on your comments later in the day. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Minister Katrine Conroy. Probably most of you know that, yes, sir, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, quick question. Chief, I'd recommend that you contact your lawyers. Okay. That's, but I mean, just, we're talking about the law. You have a right to be there. You're talking about it. Talk to your lawyer and have him get his application in there and talk to the minister. I'll also do what I can do on my side.
Thank you for that comment.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Minister Conroy now. Minister Conroy is Minister for Children and Family Development, and as an ex-deputy in the provincial government, I know that's a huge job in its own right. But she also has taken on the responsibility for shepherding the Columbia Treaty through on behalf of the provincial government, because she is the MLA for the West Kootenay, so Columbia is her back door. And my experience in working with her and her husband has been that they're passionate about the issues associated with the Columbia, and I'm personally very pleased that she's retained this portfolio and will be working with the folks in the provincial government and some of the folks in this room in bringing this treaty to a successful conclusion. So thank you very much for taking the time to come here. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, John. I had to get leave to be here this morning because the House is sitting, so I'm really happy to be here too. And I'm honored to be on the traditional territory of the Saanich and Lekwungen-speaking people. And I also want to thank the organizers, because I know how much work it took to get this together, and I want to thank you for pulling everybody together, because I know how important this discussion is. And it was only actually last week, the beginning of the week, that we learned that the discussions, that they were going to launch the negotiations down in DC starting tomorrow. So today's symposium is very timely. In fact, our lead negotiator from BC, excuse me, Kathy Eichenberger, who was supposed to speak this afternoon and can't be here because she is on her way to DC as we speak. So, and I want to talk a bit about why the negotiations are so significant to me. And as John has said, I'm from the basin, and it was a great honor for me to serve as critic when I was in opposition. I've been elected since 2005, and the entire time I was the critic for the opposition. And when I became minister responsible, it was, people question that. I am the minister responsible for children and family development and also all things Columbia, because it's Columbia River Treaty, Columbia Basin Trust, and the Columbia Power Corporation. And Some people wondered how many social workers it was going to take to negotiate the treaty. But we confirmed and assured them that the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources has I've seconded their staff that have been involved with the treaty negotiations and the work that's been done since day one. So they work with me, so we don't have to worry about any social workers doing that. So, and a lot of the stuff has already, the benefit of going last, a number of things I was going to talk about has already been mentioned, but I'll repeat some of it because I understand when you hear things twice, you actually retain it. That's what they tell me. So, and I'm learning that in this job. So the treaty is one of the best examples of international water agreements in the world, as John has said, but it's also been just more than a half a century since it was ratified. And today there are a lot of other things on the table, as you've heard, things that just weren't considered important in the late 50s, early 60s when the discussions were started. And so we need to, as we gear up to the treaty, ask ourselves the questions: what should we do differently this time? How can we make sure the voices of the Columbia Basin are heard? And what wasn't considered in the 60s that definitely needs to be considered today? And I know you'll be hearing from some other people this afternoon who will answer probably those questions. I'm looking at you, Greg, in a lot more detail than I will. So it's great that there's experts here in the room as well. And as Barb said, the original treaty was just about power control, or power generation and flood control. And there was no recognition for what was left behind, what wasn't discussed in those days. Currently, the treaty returns approximately $120 million a year on the Canadian entitlement. Some years it's been around $300 million, but the average right now is about $120 million. It's also meant that there has been significant issues it's prevented flood control, it's prevented floods. The years 2012 and 2013 in our region, there was significant flooding, and it was controlled. We never will again see the issues of what we saw in Vanport back in the late 40s when the entire community was wiped out and thousands of people died. In fact, in our region in the late 40s, my husband's here with me today, and I'm going to tell him how old you were. He was 2 in 1948. And his family farm is where the Hugh Kingley-side Dam sits now, and there's no baby pictures of him before he turned 2 because they were all lost in the flood. So there was a lot lost in the region, and the communities like Kimberley, we were just at an event on Saturday night, and some people were there, and they were telling us how she was a little girl. She said she was 6 years old at the time, and her dad was a reporter. And they were out in Kimberley dealing with the floods, and her dad said, "Go behind this building here." She went behind the building, and what they were doing, they had miners from Kimberley blowing up houses that were getting carried away by the floods with dynamite, because that was the only way they could get rid of them and prevent any further flooding. And she said as a 6-year-old, she thought, wow, that was cool. And now she thinks about it, she thought, oh my God, what would people think about that? So just the stories, though, they go on. And in those days, there was no consideration for the people, as Chief Christian has said. There was no consideration of First Nations. There was no consideration of people of the basin. The story that sticks with me is the family from Burton who was told, you need to pack your stuff and get it out of your house because we're burning your house down tomorrow. They couldn't get it all out, so they put the rest of their stuff in the shed. They came back the next day, and both the house and the shed were burned to the ground with the rest of their belongings. And that happened to many people. And the people of the day, the BC Hydro, they were doing their job. And nowadays you talk to the people that did that and they thought, my God, we were just doing our job, because that was what they did. And it was, so those kind of stories stick throughout the basin and they will stick, and they continue to stick to this day. I think that when we talk about the flood control, we need to think that this year could be, we keep hearing about the significant snowpack we have, and at this time, there's no worries, so to speak, so far, although we do have some flooding in neighboring communities. As right now, there's some concerns about the Slocan River, which is a tributary of the Kootenay, which flows into the Columbia. So there is some worries, but because of where we are and the fact that we have the flood control in our region, we will not have the floods that we've had in the past. Today our approach is going to be different, and I'm talking on behalf of the BC government, not on the government of Canada. We recognize that there was no consultation, and we recognize that there needs to be consultation. that everyone has a stake in the region and should have a chance to participate in the future of the treaty. In fact, a lot of consultation has taken place already. The government began consultation, the former government, in 2011. And in 2012, 2013, there was considerable consultation throughout the basin. They had workshops, conferences, they engaged on line, they had Facebook, Twitter, e-newsletters. And the feedback that came back is everybody agreed with the general direction the government was going on, but everybody agreed that there needed to be more consultation, that basin residents needed to be heard, that First Nations needed to be heard, and everybody wanted to continue to be engaged during the upcoming negotiations. In 2014, the provincial review team formed the Columbia Basin Regional Advisory Committee, which is made up from representatives of local government, of First Nations from the region, representatives from the provincial government, BC Hydro, and the citizens of the basin. And this committee will also be providing input and feedback on the negotiations. We also have a really strong local governments committee, which was started in 2011, and it has been an extremely strong voice for constituents, their constituents, throughout the basin. And they meet regularly with the provincial representatives, and they too have submitted their own recommendations on the future of the treaty. We also are going to be conducting future local engagement meetings in June, and we're holding those community meetings at 8 different communities throughout the basin to ensure that, once again, that voices of the basin can be heard. They're going to provide an update during those sessions on the treaty negotiations, a review and discussion of where we are, how we got to where we are today, and a summary of BC and Canada's work as we prepare for these negotiations. So a lot of work has happened to date that actually took place under the previous government. And I was really pleased when Premier Horgan asked me to take on this role in addition to children and families, and to work with the provincial review team that has been in place, because the Columbia Review, or the Columbia Treaty, it's very much a nonpartisan issue. And the former minister worked with me as the critic, and I now work with the critic, the existing critic, as the minister. And we all agree that this is a situation in politics where you need to put politics aside, where we do need to work together, and it's working well. So I think that it's important to acknowledge that and make sure people recognize that. Because the treaty is an agreement between Canada and the government of the United States, so I want to speak a bit about our perspective from the provincial perspective. So the federal government is the constitutional lead on these negotiations, but they support our interests, BC's interests, and they recognize that most of the issues are actually provincial in scope, and BC will be at the negotiating table. In '63, Canada and BC signed an agreement whereby Canada transferred most of the obligations and benefits of the treaty to BC. So this puts us in the driver's seat around implementing the treaty and existing treaty and receiving its benefits. And I also want to stress that as we enter the negotiations and look to the future of the treaty, the Columbia Basin First Nations in this province are partners with us on the negotiations. The provincial government, as I said, has been consulting with First Nations since 2012 to better understand the Indigenous interests and rights and how they can be protected and enhanced during the upcoming negotiations. And since 2016, the governments of Canada and BC have been meeting as a group with the Tanaha, the Shwepmem, and the Okanagan Nation Alliance. And it's nice to see you guys here today. Thanks. That's good. And these meetings have been to clarify areas of interest and concern, and to discuss First Nations' role leading up to and during treaty negotiations, including their desired outcomes for their nations. So our government is committed to true and lasting reconciliation and with the Indigenous people in British Columbia. And last week, we released a set of draft principles to help guide all public service as we build relationships with Indigenous peoples based on respect and recognition of inherent rights. And the principles do guide our implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and the recent directions from the courts. So these principles do reflect our government's desire to renew its relationship with Indigenous people in BC and to achieve a government-to-government relationship based on respect, recognition, and exercise of the Aboriginal title and rights, and to the reconciliation of Aboriginal and Crown titles and jurisdiction. In fact, in my ministry, my other hat, I'll talk about it briefly, Children and Families, we've just tabled and have had passed, it'll get royal assent the end of this week, legislation which allows us to begin the discussion to actually begin the transfer of jurisdiction of child welfare to the various nations across the province. And I'm really very happy to be and proud that we are working very closely with Chief Christensen and the Secwépemc Nation, because I think it's really important that we can do that as a provincial government, and to recognize that ultimately the jurisdiction of child welfare needs to be under the rights of the First Nations in BC. So we are continuing to work in our engagement with the First Nations. In fact, the consultations have been quite comprehensive. In fact, I think that our team has been meeting every 2 weeks with the First Nations in the last 3 months since, yes, she's shaking her head, yes, to ensure that those discussions take place. And our government has supported the discussions and the decisions being made with emphasis on the key priorities during those discussions. But as we enter on negotiations, we need to make sure that there are equal benefits on both sides of the border. I know there was some discussion, I think Barb actually talked about the fact that some Americans think we're getting too much money, and some Canadians think we're not getting enough, and that there's issues that have to be looked at that haven't been looked at, the fish, the ecosystem, tourism, the water levels on our side of the river, side of the border. And we do need to recognize those ongoing impacts in the BC Basin. We need to know that we need to have the ability to mitigate those issues. I think that it's, we just have to look at what happens in the summer. And for those who've been in the basin will know it well, but the upper Arrow Lakes gets pretty dry in the summer, and the Roosevelt Reservoir is always up. It's always full. It's full pools. So when you're looking at tourism in our region, you can see the concerns. When you're looking at agriculture, our basin had, especially in the Arrow Lakes Basin, had one of the potential for being the third most productive agricultural portion of BC. It doesn't now. That land's flooded. And it will never be a prime agricultural base again. Across the border, there's considerable agricultural benefits by the irrigation that's provided by the Columbia River. There's considerable benefits that are provided by the treaty by transportation. The fact that they can transport logs, they can transport grain from, okay, 5 minutes, grain from Idaho right to the Vanport, right to where the border, Columbia River meets the ocean. We can't do that in BC, and I often think, can you imagine the difference in that transportation would be in this province if we could transport coal from the East Kootenays right to the Pacific Ocean? What a difference that would make. Or agriculture, like you think of the difference of what could happen in BC that can't happen. So it's there is some considerable differences, and the bottom line though is that we need to ensure that that it has to be a win-win operation on both sides. I think now, especially with I think Barb discussed it, the issues around flood control and the fact that in 2024, that ends for the Americans, and they do need to renegotiate that with us. That's not part of the Columbia River Treaty. And so if they want flood control, they will need to negotiate that with us, and they will need to provide with some kind of reciprocal agreement. And for most of us, we feel that's some kind of financial agreement. But they will need that in order to, even you might have seen the potential of flood control in Portland last year and this year as well. And they know that they need our flood control to enable their areas not to be flooded. So there will be discussions that need to be taken under advisement. But ecosystems are currently and will continue to be an issue, an important consideration in this treaty. And the Columbia River Treaty Review Team has been exploring options to enhance this and to ensure that the health of the ecosystem is a priority. And it has to be work that's science-based, and there's a number of scientists that are involved, from First Nations, from locals, from local government, from provincial and federal government, who have been working hard to develop and describe the ecosystem's objectives and performance measures to evaluate different options for what the treaty could look like in the future. And the same type of work has been done in the United States. So we have heard clearly that the recognition of the ecosystems needs to very much be a part of the treaty. And I think that it's important to acknowledge, too, around the question of salmon reintroduction. We recognize, our government recognizes that this is a very important issue, and we want to talk about it. We also recognize that this is an issue that needs to be led by Canada, because it was the government of Canada who, when the Grand Coulee Dam was built in the 30s, the American government actually approached the Canadian government and said, is it going to be an issue to people in the basin? Is it going to be an issue to First Nations? I don't know if the American government in the 30s would have asked that, Wayne. Do you think they would? I don't think they would have. But, you know, would the people of the basin, would they care if the salmon is prevented from coming? And the government of the day, the Canadian government of the day, said, oh, no, it's not an issue at all. So we think that the Canadian government needs to accept that responsibility and work with all of us to do what we can to return the fish to our region. So we are playing a very, very supportive role in that issue. Another issue which was raised was climate change. Well, the BC portion of the basin is only 15% of the entire watershed. It delivers 30 to 45% of total flows depending on the annual snowpack. And the climate change models, they predict that the BC portion will have about the same total inflow, less snow, more rain, but the lower Columbia in the US can expect earlier snowmelt and 20 to 40% less total annual inflow. So on top of this unpredictable extreme rainfall events, will add to the challenge of managing reservoirs to minimize floods. So the US side of the basin is expected to have hotter, drier summers and multi-year droughts. And this will have a significant impact on the US efforts to recover their endangered salmon populations, as well as affecting their municipal and industrial water supply and agriculture. Water storage in reservoirs can help mitigate low water conditions in BC and the US. And I've already talked about some of those issues, and we talked about some of the floods. And I think it's important to remember that when the called upon flood control, when it switches to called upon in 2024, I think it's important that the U.S. recognize that this is incredibly important to us, and they do. They do recognize it, and they recognize that it's part of the process and part of the ongoing treaty. So I think that as I'm getting my wrap up. Oh my God, he just did this, Ed. My husband stands at the back of the room when I'm giving speeches, and when I've talked too much, he goes like this. This young man just did this to me, hon. So, again, good job. You didn't get that sign, Wayne. Again, it's, we want to make sure this is not a win-lose. We want to ensure that voices are at the table that need to be heard, including First Nations, including the basin residents, and they were not heard in the 60s, and we need to ensure that those voices are heard today. And right now we have a small group of professional negotiators that are at the table negotiating for us. And a lot of people have asked when I'm leaving for DC. I'm not going to be at the table. None of the politicians are going to be at the table. It's going to be it's professional negotiators who've been working on this for many years, and we want to make sure it's a win-win for everybody involved. So thank you.
So before we wrap up for the coffee break, two tasks. One is that Mr. Conroy, she's mentioned, has got duties in the House, so she won't be here for the balance of the day. I believe you're coming to the reception tonight.
try.
Yeah, at 5:30. But if so, this is the only chance. If anyone has got a question directly of the BC government, this is your only chance.
Good presentation. Thank you.
Sorry, for all the questions, that actually needs to be through the microphone so it can be captured on the webcast.
There's a mic there, but there's no mic.
There's no mic. That's a virtual mic.
Okay, so the question was, given BC's commitment to UNDRIP and reconciliation, I'm wondering what role or what measures you can take in putting pressure on the Canadian and American governments to make sure that First Nations are present at the negotiation table.
So, is this on? Can I talk in this? You can all hear me? Okay. So it is the Canadian government's decision, and they've made that decision, but we have been very clear that the three First Nations will be involved in discussions and have been involved in discussions since 2012, and we will continue to ensure that those voices are heard at the table.
Any other questions? So if people, questions come to people's minds, you've got a card in your kit for the day's meeting. So please write them down and write your name and submit them to one of the organizers, and we'll have an opportunity to deal with questions in 4 o'clock onwards in the afternoon. So I'm going to wrap up today's session. I just wanted to make a couple of overriding comments. One is, I think the whole purpose of this session was to talk about, sorry, do you have a question?
I do.
Go,
I was trying
go
to find
ahead.
a microphone. It's actually the same question. I just wanted to reiterate it. It was pretty ironic or hypocritical or contradictory or something. Thank you for your comments, Minister, first of all. Last week to read the draft Principles of Reconciliation, and then in the very same week to hear that these nations are being excluded from the talks. And so I do think that the BC government could do more to not just be consulting with the nations and trying to bring forward their voice, but actually be lobbying the Canadian government to get those nations a seat at the table. And so I just wanted to reiterate the question to ask if there's anything more that the BC government could do to help make that happen. Thanks.
So the purpose of this session was really to answer the question, what's the issues around the Columbia Treaty? And I think it's fair to say that in the presentations this morning, we found out there's a new burst of energy around the Columbia based on the opportunity to renegotiate. And Bob Cousins pointed out the history and the current issues and how they're being addressed. And the role of the IJC has been fundamental in the past, and I think it potentially has a role in the future. Chief Wayne Christian did a very passionate and eloquent speech about the role of the First Nations and their engagement in the process, and the need to continue to be engaged formally in the negotiations, plus some of the principles around which First Nations have to be engaged. I think the most telling points, one is that there's only one water, and the Columbia is one system. And secondly, that the three Indigenous nations in Canada are now being brought together as a common attempt to start to deal with their interests as a joint group rather than individually, and that will make their voices much more powerful. And finally, Minister Conroy pointed out her passion around the Columbia, her engagement in the past, and her commitment to a win-win situation. And I have to say, from my knowledge of her working, she has a lot to offer in that regard. So I'm glad that she's on this file. So thank you for your attention. You can have a 15-minute coffee break, and I'll pass it over to the organizers at about 11:15 to come back and start the next panel.